Marcus Chun adjusted the torn baseball cap on his head and pulled the dirty jacket tighter around his shoulders. The expensive watch that usually adorned his wrist was safely locked away in his penthouse apartment, replaced by a cheap plastic timepiece he had bought from a convenience store. His perfectly manicured hands were now deliberately dirty, his face unshaven for 3 days. Looking at himself in the reflection of a shop window, he barely recognized the man staring back. At 42, Marcus was the founder and CEO of Chun Technologies, a company worth over $8 billion. His empire spanned across artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and telecommunications. Forbes had ranked him among the top 50 richest people in the world for the past 5 years. Yet here he was, standing on the corner of 5th Street in downtown Portland, dressed like someone who had not seen a proper meal in weeks. This transformation was not for a movie role or a publicity stunt. Marcus had grown increasingly disturbed by the growing gap between the wealthy and the poor in America. Despite his numerous charitable foundations and donations, he felt disconnected from the reality that millions of Americans faced every day. The idea had come to him during a board meeting when his assistant mentioned that homelessness in Portland had increased by 30% in the past year. "Sir, perhaps we should consider increasing our donation to the homeless shelter network," she had suggested while reviewing quarterly charitable giving reports. Marcus had nodded absently, signing another check for $1 million without really thinking about it. But something about that moment bothered him. He was writing checks to solve problems he had never truly experienced or understood. How could he effectively help people whose struggles he had never witnessed firsthand? That night, Marcus had made a decision that would change his life forever. He would spend 2 weeks living as a homeless person in Portland, experiencing the challenges that thousands faced every day. He would eat at soup kitchens, sleep in shelters, and try to survive on the streets with nothing but the clothes on his back and $20 in his pocket. His lawyers, assistants, and board members had all tried to talk him out of it. They called it dangerous, unnecessary, and potentially damaging to the company's image if word got out. But Marcus was determined. He had grown up poor, the son of immigrants who had worked multiple jobs to put food on the table. Somewhere along the way to building his empire, he had forgotten what it felt like to worry about where his next meal would come from. Now, 3 days into his experiment, Marcus was beginning to understand just how naive he had been about poverty and homelessness. The nights were cold, even in late spring. The shelter beds were uncomfortable and often full. Finding clean restrooms was a constant challenge. But perhaps most difficult was the way people looked at him, or rather, the way they looked through him as if he did not exist. His stomach rumbled as he walked down the busy street. He had eaten a small breakfast at the Mission earlier that morning, but lunch was still hours away. The $20 he had started with was nearly gone, spent on a few small items, and a night at a cheap motel when the shelter had been full. He was learning to stretch every penny, to make difficult choices between basic needs. As he walked, Marcus noticed a small diner tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore. Maggie's Kitchen, read the faded sign above the door. Through the windows, he could see it was busy with the lunch crowd. Well-dressed office workers sat at tables covered with red checkered tablecloths, enjoying what looked like generous portions of comfort food. Marcus hesitated at the door. In his current appearance, he was not sure he would even be allowed inside. But his hunger was growing stronger, and he had noticed a small sign in the window that gave him hope. No one turned away. Kindness served daily. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warm smell of fresh bread and soup immediately hit him, making his mouth water. Conversations continued around him, but he noticed a few customers glance in his direction with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. The diner was exactly what he had expected from the outside. Worn vinyl booths lined the walls, and a long counter with spinning stools dominated the center of the space. The black and white checkered floor showed years of wear, and the walls were covered with photographs of what appeared to be regular customers and local landmarks. Despite its age, everything was clean and well-maintained. Behind the counter, a woman in her mid-30s moved efficiently between tasks. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore a simple white apron over jeans and a t-shirt. She looked up as Marcus entered, and their eyes met briefly. Unlike the other customers, her expression showed no judgment or discomfort, just acknowledgement of a new arrival. Marcus stood uncertainly near the entrance, not sure of the protocol. In his normal life, hostesses would immediately approach him, recognizing his status and wealth. Here, he was just another person, and not a particularly welcome-looking one at that. "Sit wherever you like, honey," called the woman from behind the counter. Her voice was warm and friendly, with a slight southern accent. "I'll be right with you." Marcus chose a small booth near the back, partially hidden from the other customers. He slid across the vinyl seat and picked up the laminated menu that was already on the table. The prices were reasonable, but even the cheapest items were more than he could afford with his remaining money. A few minutes later, the waitress approached his table. Up close, Marcus could see that she had kind brown eyes and a genuine smile. Her name tag read Sarah. She carried a notepad and pen, ready to take his order. "What can I get for you today?" Sarah asked, setting down a glass of water without being asked. Marcus studied the menu again, calculating in his head. "I was wondering," he began hesitantly. "Do you have any leftovers from lunch? Or maybe something small? I only have about $3. He felt his face flush with embarrassment as he said the words. In his real life, Marcus had not thought about the price of a meal in decades. He owned restaurants where a single appetizer cost more than he was asking to spend on an entire meal. Sarah's expression did not change, showing no surprise or judgment at his request. "Let me see what I can do for you," she said simply. "You just sit tight." Marcus watched as Sarah walked back toward the kitchen. He expected her to return with bad news, perhaps offering him a small cup of soup or a day-old roll. Most restaurants had policies against serving leftovers to customers, and he would not have blamed her for following the rules. Instead, Sarah disappeared into the kitchen for several minutes. Marcus could hear the sounds of plates clinking and quiet conversation between Sarah and what he assumed was the cook. Other customers continued to eat and chat around him, unaware of the small drama playing out at his table. When Sarah returned, Marcus was stunned. She carried a full plate of food, a thick sandwich piled high with roast beef and vegetables, a generous serving of homemade potato salad, and a pickle spear. Alongside the plate, she set down a bowl of steaming vegetable soup and a fresh dinner roll with butter. "Here you go," Sarah said, placing the feast in front of him. "Chef's special today." Marcus stared at the food in disbelief. "I can't pay for all this," he said quietly. "I told you I only have $3. Sarah smiled and sat down across from him in the booth. "Don't worry about it. We had some extra portions back there, and I'd rather see it go to someone who needs it than throw it away. Besides, Maggie always says that food tastes better when it's shared with someone who's hungry." "Maggie?" Marcus asked. "She owns this place. Been running it for 25 years. She's not here today, but she's got a rule about never turning away anyone who's hungry. Says everyone deserves a good meal and a moment of kindness." Marcus felt an unexpected emotion welling up inside him. In 3 days on the streets, he had experienced mostly indifference and occasional hostility. This simple act of generosity from a stranger was overwhelming. "Thank you," he managed to say. "This is incredibly kind." "Just eat up," Sarah said, standing to return to her other customers. "And take your time. No rush." As Marcus began to eat, he found himself fighting back tears. The food was delicious, simple, but prepared with obvious care. The roast beef was tender and flavorful. The potato salad had a perfect balance of flavors, and the soup warmed him from the inside out. But it was more than just the physical nourishment that moved him. It was the dignity with which Sarah had treated him, the absence of pity or condescension in her manner. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, and trying to make the meal last. Around him, the lunch crowd began to thin out as people returned to their offices and jobs. Sarah moved efficiently between tables, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, and chatting with regular customers who clearly knew her well. Marcus noticed that Sarah treated everyone with the same warm professionalism, whether they were well-dressed business people or blue-collar workers. She remembered orders without writing them down, asked about family members by name, and seemed to have a kind word for everyone. This was clearly more than just a job for her. It was a calling. As he finished his meal, Marcus realized that this experience was teaching him more about human nature and social responsibility than all his business school classes combined. In his corporate world, acts of charity were often calculated for maximum tax benefit and publicity value. Here, Sarah had shown him genuine compassion with no expectation of recognition or reward. When Sarah returned to check on him, Marcus had finished every crumb on his plate. "That was the best meal I've had in days," he said truthfully. "Thank you again." "I'm glad you enjoyed it," Sarah replied, beginning to clear the dishes. "You're welcome back anytime. We're here every day except Sunday." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his 3 remaining dollars, placing them on the table. "I wish I could tip you more." Sarah looked at the money and then back at Marcus. "Keep your money," she said gently. "Save it for something you really need. Your thanks are enough for me." This gesture stunned Marcus even more than the free meal. Sarah was clearly working for tips, and $3 would have been significant for someone in her position. Yet she was refusing his money out of concern for his welfare. "I insist," Marcus said, pushing the bills toward her. "You've been incredibly kind, and good service deserves to be recognized." After a moment's hesitation, Sarah picked up 2 of the dollars and left one on the table. "Compromise," she said with a smile. "You keep $1 for yourself, and I'll take something for my effort." "Deal." Marcus nodded, understanding that she was allowing him to maintain his dignity while still accepting some recognition for her kindness. It was a perfect balance of generosity and respect. As Marcus prepared to leave, he found himself wanting to know more about this remarkable woman. "Have you worked here long?" he asked. "About 4 years now," Sarah replied. "I started part-time when I was going to nursing school and just stayed on. The people here are like family." "Nursing school?" Marcus was intrigued. Sarah's expression grew slightly wistful. "I had to drop out when my mom got sick. Someone needed to take care of her, and this job has good flexible hours. Maybe I'll finish someday." Marcus felt another pang of emotion. Here was someone who had sacrificed her own dreams to care for a family member, yet she was still finding ways to help strangers like him. The contrast between her selflessness and his own privileged existence was stark. "I'm sure you will," Marcus said. "You seem like someone who doesn't give up easily." "We all do what we have to do," Sarah said philosophically. "Life doesn't always go according to plan, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to make things better." As Marcus stood to leave, he realized that this conversation would stay with him long after his 2-week experiment ended. Sarah had no idea who he really was, yet she had shown him more genuine human kindness than he had experienced in years of high-society charity events and corporate networking. "Thank you again," Marcus said as he headed toward the door. "For everything. Take care of yourself," Sarah called after him. "And remember, you're always welcome here." Marcus stepped back onto the busy street, but his perspective had fundamentally shifted. The afternoon sun felt warmer on his face, and the sounds of the city seemed less harsh. For the first time in his adult life, he had experienced what it meant to be truly vulnerable and to have that vulnerability met with compassion rather than exploitation. As he walked away from Maggie's kitchen, Marcus began to understand that his experiment was revealing more than just the challenges faced by homeless individuals. It was showing him the capacity for goodness that existed in people like Sarah, people who had very little material wealth, but who possessed something far more valuable: the ability to see the humanity in every person they met. The rest of his afternoon was spent reflecting on the encounter. Marcus found a small park where he sat on a bench, watching people pass by and thinking about what he had learned. In his business world, every transaction was calculated, every relationship measured in terms of potential profit or strategic advantage. But Sarah had operated from a completely different set of values, ones that prioritized human dignity and compassion over personal gain. As evening approached, Marcus made his way toward the shelter where he had been staying. The building was already filling up with people seeking a place to sleep for the night. As he waited in line, he struck up conversations with other homeless individuals, learning their stories and gaining insights into the complex factors that had led them to their current situations. Many of the people he met defied his previous assumptions about homelessness. There was Janet, a former teacher who had lost her job and apartment after a prolonged illness. Robert was a veteran struggling with PTSD who had difficulty maintaining steady employment. Maria was a single mother whose minimum wage job didn't cover both rent and childcare, forcing her to choose between shelter and keeping her children fed. Each story was unique, but they all shared common themes: unexpected crises, insufficient support systems, and the difficulty of climbing back up once you had fallen through society's safety net. These were not lazy or irresponsible people. They were individuals who had encountered challenges that exceeded their resources and resilience. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Portland weather that seemed to seep through every layer of clothing Marcus wore. He had spent a restless night at the shelter, surrounded by the sounds of coughing, snoring, and the occasional nightmare-induced shout from fellow residents. His body ached from the thin mattress, and his designer-trained palate recoiled from the instant coffee and stale donuts served for breakfast. By mid-morning, Marcus found himself walking the streets with no particular destination in mind. His remaining dollar felt heavy in his pocket, a reminder of how quickly money disappeared when you had so little to begin with. The rain had started in earnest, and he sought shelter under the awning of a closed storefront. As he stood there watching people hurry past with umbrellas and raincoats, Marcus noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Sarah from Maggie's Kitchen, walking quickly with her head down against the rain. She carried a large paper bag and seemed to be heading somewhere with purpose. Without thinking, Marcus called out to her, "Sarah." She looked up, surprised, and her face brightened when she recognized him. "Hey there, how are you doing?" She jogged over to share the awning with him, shaking raindrops from her hair. "Getting wet, mostly," Marcus replied with a rueful smile. "What brings you out in this weather?" Sarah held up the paper bag. "Lunch delivery. Mrs. Patterson down on Elm Street broke her hip last week, and she can't get out to buy groceries. Maggie makes me bring her a hot meal every day." Marcus was struck once again by the casual way Sarah described this act of kindness. "That's very thoughtful of you." "Oh, it's nothing special. Mrs. Patterson has been coming to the diner for 15 years. When her husband was alive, they came in every Friday night for dinner. After he passed, she kept coming, but alone. We all look out for each other around here." The rain showed no signs of letting up, and Marcus found himself asking, "Mind if I walk with you? I don't have anywhere particular to be." "Of course. I'd enjoy the company. Mrs. Patterson will probably want to meet you too. She loves talking to new people." As they walked through the rain-soaked streets, Sarah pointed out various landmarks and shared stories about the neighborhood. She knew which businesses had been there for decades, which families had recently moved in, and where the best deals could be found on everything from groceries to secondhand clothes. "You really know this area well," Marcus observed. "I've lived here most of my life," Sarah explained. "After my dad died when I was 12, Mom and I moved here because the rent was cheap. It's not the fanciest neighborhood, but it's got character. People here look out for each other." Marcus was beginning to understand that Sarah's kindness toward him was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of community care that seemed to define this area. In his wealthy circles, neighbors were often strangers who happened to live in expensive houses near each other. Here, there seemed to be genuine interconnection and mutual support. They arrived at a small apartment building that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the steps were cracked, but the windows were clean, and there were flower boxes filled with colorful blooms despite the dreary weather. "Mrs. Patterson lives on the second floor," Sarah explained as they climbed the narrow staircase. "She's 83 and has more energy than most people half her age. Well, she did before the fall." Sarah knocked on a door marked 2B. "Mrs. Patterson? It's Sarah with your lunch." The door opened to reveal a tiny woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Despite her recent injury and the walking cast on her leg, her eyes were bright and alert. She looked curiously at Marcus. "And who might this be?" she asked with a slight Irish accent. "This is my friend," Sarah said, glancing at Marcus and realizing she didn't know his name. "Marcus," he supplied quickly. "Marcus was keeping me company on this rainy day. I hope you don't mind that I brought him along." "Mind? Heavens no. Come in, both of you. It's been too quiet around here since I've been stuck inside." Mrs. Patterson's apartment was small but immaculate. The furniture was old but well-maintained, and every surface was covered with photographs of family members, friends, and what appeared to be decades of memories. The smell of lavender and vanilla filled the air. Sit," Mrs. Patterson insisted, gesturing toward a floral sofa. Sarah, be a dear and put that food in the kitchen. I'll make us some tea. You should be resting that leg, Sarah protested. Let me make the tea. Nonsense. I've been making tea for 70 years. I think I can manage. As Sarah unpacked the lunch in the small kitchen, Mrs. Patterson settled into her favorite chair with obvious relief. So Marcus, tell me about yourself. Are you new to the neighborhood? Marcus hesitated, not sure how to answer. He had become skilled at deflecting personal questions during his time on the streets, but Mrs. Patterson's direct gaze seemed to see right through any pretense. I'm just passing through, he said finally, trying to get to know the area better. Mrs. Patterson said, studying him with the sharp eyes of someone who had observed human nature for 8 decades. Well, you've certainly met the right person for that. Sarah knows everyone and everything about this neighborhood. She's a treasure, that one. Sarah returned with 3 cups of tea on a small tray. Mrs. Patterson, you're embarrassing me. I'm not embarrassing you, dear. I'm telling the truth. This young woman, Mrs. Patterson said, addressing Marcus, has been taking care of half the neighborhood since she was old enough to reach the stove. When my Harold was sick, she brought us soup twice a week for 3 months. Never asked for anything in return, never made a fuss about it. Marcus watched Sarah's face turn red as she tried to change the subject. How's your leg feeling today? Any less pain? Oh, it's fine. Nothing that won't heal with time. But tell me about your friend here. What do you do for work, Marcus? The question caught Marcus off guard again. In his real life, this question usually led to immediate recognition and a shift in how people treated him. Now, he found himself in the unusual position of not wanting to lie, but also not being able to tell the truth. I'm between jobs right now, he said carefully, trying to figure out what comes next. Mrs. Patterson nodded sympathetically. These are difficult times for finding good work. Too many companies more interested in profits than in taking care of their employees. But you seem like a bright young man. Something will turn up. The irony of her words was not lost on Marcus. Here he was, probably the wealthiest person this woman had ever met, receiving career advice and encouragement from someone living on a fixed income in a rundown apartment building. Mrs. Patterson used to work at the post office, Sarah explained. 35 years of service. Best job I ever had, Mrs. Patterson said with pride. Back then, people understood that work was about more than just a paycheck. It was about serving your community, being part of something bigger than yourself. As they sat drinking tea and eating some cookies that Mrs. Patterson had baked before her fall, Marcus found himself drawn into conversation about the neighborhood, its history, and the changes they had all witnessed over the years. Mrs. Patterson told stories of when the area had been primarily working-class families, many of them immigrants building better lives for their children. Things have gotten harder for folks around here, she admitted. Rent's going up, but wages aren't keeping pace. Too many of my neighbors are working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. And don't get me started on what's happened to healthcare costs. Marcus thought about his own company's health insurance plan, which was considered generous by corporate standards, but was probably still out of reach for most of the people in this neighborhood. He made a mental note to research what percentage of his employees actually used the benefits he thought he was providing. But people still look out for each other, Sarah added. Like when the Gonzalez family's apartment flooded last month. Within 2 hours, half the building was helping them move their belongings and finding them a place to stay. That's the difference between a neighborhood and just a place where people happen to live, Mrs. Patterson said wisely. You can't buy that kind of community, no matter how much money you have. Marcus felt as if she were speaking directly to his own experience. In his gated community, he barely knew his neighbors' names, let alone their struggles or triumphs. People there seemed to value privacy and independence over connection and mutual support. After an hour of conversation, Sarah began to gather the empty dishes. We should let you rest, Mrs. Patterson. Doctor's orders. Bah, doctors. Mrs. Patterson waved dismissively. But you're probably right. These old bones need more rest than they used to. She turned to Marcus. It was lovely meeting you, dear. I hope you'll come back and visit again. I'd like that very much, Marcus said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson grabbed Sarah's hand. You take care of yourself, sweetheart. And don't be so quick to put everyone else's needs before your own. You deserve happiness too. Marcus noticed a flicker of sadness cross Sarah's face before she smiled and kissed Mrs. Patterson's cheek. "I'm perfectly happy. Don't you worry about me." Once they were back on the street, Marcus found himself curious about Mrs. Patterson's comment. "She seems very fond of you." "Mrs. Patterson is like a grandmother to me," Sarah said. "She's been looking out for me since I was a kid. Sometimes I think she worries too much." What did she mean about putting everyone else's needs first? Sarah was quiet for a moment as they walked. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. "Oh, you know how older people are. They think everyone should be married with kids by a certain age. She doesn't understand that some people are happy with their lives just as they are." Marcus sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't want to pry. Instead, he found himself asking, "Do you ever think about leaving this neighborhood? Moving somewhere with more opportunities?" Sarah stopped walking and looked at him with surprise. "Why would I want to leave? This is my home. These are my people. My mom is buried in the cemetery 3 blocks from here. This is where I belong." The conviction in her voice made Marcus realize how different their worldviews were. He had spent his adult life moving freely around the world, changing locations based on business opportunities or personal whims. The idea of being rooted to a place because of relationships and history was foreign to him, but he was beginning to see its value. "I didn't mean to suggest you should leave," Marcus said quickly. "I just wondered if you ever felt limited by staying in one place." "I think some people confuse moving around with moving forward," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "You can grow and change without abandoning the people who matter to you. Besides, this neighborhood needs people who care about it. If everyone with ambition leaves, who's going to make it better for the ones who can't leave?" Her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. How many communities had he and his peers abandoned in their pursuit of wealth and status? How many neighborhoods could have been improved if successful people had chosen to invest their time and resources locally instead of moving to isolated enclaves? They had arrived back at Maggie's kitchen, where the lunch crowd was beginning to gather. "I should get back to work," Sarah said. "Thanks for walking with me. Mrs. Patterson really enjoyed meeting you." "Thank you for letting me come along," Marcus replied. "It meant a lot to me." As he watched Sarah disappear into the diner, Marcus realized that his morning had taught him as much about community and belonging as his entire business education had taught him about success. He was beginning to understand that his wealth had isolated him not just from poverty, but from the kind of authentic human connections that people like Sarah and Mrs. Patterson took for granted. The afternoon stretched ahead of him with no particular agenda. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus had nowhere he needed to be and nothing pressing to accomplish. In his regular life, every minute was scheduled, every interaction had a purpose. This enforced slowness was initially uncomfortable, but gradually he began to appreciate the luxury of unstructured time. He spent the afternoon exploring the neighborhood more thoroughly, paying attention to details he would have missed from the window of his usual chauffeur-driven car. He noticed which buildings were well-maintained and which were falling into disrepair. He saw how people interacted on the street, the informal networks of communication and support that kept the community functioning. At a small corner market, he watched the elderly owner extend credit to customers who were short on cash, keeping informal tabs in a worn notebook. When a mother couldn't afford both milk and bread for her children, the owner quietly put both items in her bag and waved away her protests about payment. At a bus stop, he observed a teenage boy helping an elderly man navigate the complicated schedule, then giving up his own seat when the bus arrived crowded. When a young mother struggled to collapse her stroller while holding a crying baby, multiple strangers stepped forward to help without being asked. These small acts of kindness were happening constantly, Marcus realized. They were the invisible infrastructure that kept communities functioning, the social glue that held neighborhoods together. In his wealthy world, such interactions were mediated by money and service providers. Here, they happened through direct human connection and mutual responsibility. As evening approached, Marcus found himself drawn back toward Maggie's kitchen. Through the windows, he could see that the dinner crowd was different from the lunch group. These were people ending their workday, many of them looking tired but stopping to chat with Sarah and the other staff as if they were old friends. Marcus hesitated outside, not sure if he should go in. He had no money for dinner, and He didn't want to presume on Sarah's kindness again. But, as he stood there debating, Sarah spotted him through the window and waved him inside. "Perfect timing," she said as he entered. "We've got leftover soup from lunch, and Maggie always says leftover soup tastes better the second day." Before Marcus could protest, she had seated him at the same booth as the day before and brought him another generous meal. This time, it was a thick beef stew with fresh bread and a side salad that looked like it had been prepared specifically for him rather than assembled from leftovers. "Sarah, I can't keep accepting free meals from you," Marcus said as she set the food down. "You're not accepting them from me," she replied with a smile. "You're accepting them from Maggie. This is her place, and these are her rules. Besides, you brought me good company today. That's worth more than a bowl of soup." As Marcus ate, he noticed that several other customers nodded or spoke to him, as if he were a regular. Word seemed to have spread that he was under Sarah's protection, which apparently extended his welcome throughout the diner community. An older man at the counter turned around and introduced himself. "I'm Frank. Sarah says you're new to the neighborhood." "Just visiting," Marcus replied carefully. "Well, if you decide to stick around, there's always work to be found if you're willing to do it. I run a small construction crew, and we can always use an extra hand." The offer was genuine and well-meant, but it highlighted the assumptions people were making about Marcus's circumstances. They saw his appearance and concluded he was unemployed, possibly homeless, and in need of work. In offering help, they were extending the same community support network that had embraced Sarah and sustained Mrs. Patterson. "That's very kind of you," Marcus said. "I'll keep that in mind." As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself part of casual conversations with other diners. They talked about local politics, upcoming community events, concerns about neighborhood changes, and shared stories about mutual friends and family members. It was the kind of social interaction that Marcus had not experienced since his childhood, before wealth had created barriers between him and ordinary human connection. When the dinner crowd began to thin out, Sarah sat down across from him again. "So what did you think of Mrs. Patterson?" "She's remarkable," Marcus said honestly. "How long has she lived in that apartment?" "About 20 years. After her husband died, she couldn't afford their house anymore. But she wanted to stay in the neighborhood. That building isn't much to look at, but it's clean and safe, and the rent is reasonable." Marcus thought about his own real estate portfolio, which included several apartment buildings in the city. He wondered if any of his tenants were struggling like Mrs. Patterson had, and whether his property managers were handling their situations with the same compassion that this community showed its members. "She seems very proud," Marcus observed. "She is. Sometimes too proud. It took us months to convince her to let us bring her meals after her husband got sick. She kept insisting she could manage on her own." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "I think people who've worked hard all their lives have trouble accepting help, even when they need it." Marcus understood this observation more deeply than Sarah could know. His own parents had struggled with accepting assistance from their children, even after Marcus had become successful. There was a dignity in self-reliance that could become a barrier to receiving care from others. "What about you?" Marcus asked. "Do you ever need help that you don't ask for?" Sarah laughed, but there was a slight edge to it. "I'm fine. I've gotten pretty good at taking care of myself." Marcus sensed that this was a sensitive topic, but something in her tone suggested that her self-reliance might be more necessity than choice. He thought about Mrs. Patterson's earlier comment about Sarah putting everyone else's needs first, and wondered what sacrifices she had made that others didn't see. As the evening wound down and the last customers departed, Marcus prepared to leave as well. "Thank you again for another wonderful meal, and for letting me meet Mrs. Patterson. She really enjoyed it. She doesn't get many visitors these days. Most of her old friends have either moved away or passed on." Marcus woke up on his 5th day to the jarring sound of his phone buzzing insistently. For a moment, he forgot where he was and reached for the device with the automatic response of a CEO accustomed to handling crises at all hours. Then, reality crashed back as he remembered his current circumstances and location in the homeless shelter. The phone was one of his few connections to his real life, though he had turned it off for most of his experiment. Now, seeing 17 missed calls from his assistant and board members, he realized that his absence was beginning to create problems. He quickly silenced the device and tucked it away, but the intrusion of his other world left him feeling unsettled. After the standard shelter breakfast, Marcus found himself walking aimlessly through the downtown area, his mind churning with questions about the sustainability of his experiment. The phone calls were a reminder that he had responsibilities and commitments that went far beyond his personal enlightenment. Thousands of people depended on his company for their livelihoods, and investors had entrusted him with billions of dollars in capital. Yet the lessons he was learning on the streets felt more important than any business meeting he had ever attended. The conversations with Sarah and Mrs. Patterson had revealed depths of human experience that his privileged existence had never allowed him to explore. How could he return to his ivory tower without fundamentally changing how he lived and worked? Lost in these thoughts, Marcus almost walked past Maggie's kitchen without noticing. It was Sarah's voice calling out to him that snapped him back to the present moment. Marcus! Perfect timing again. He looked up to see her standing in the doorway with a concerned expression on her face. Is everything okay? He asked. Well, that depends on your perspective, Sarah replied. Mrs. Patterson fell again yesterday evening. She's fine, but she's back in the hospital for observation. I was hoping you might want to visit her with me during my lunch break. The request caught Marcus off guard. In his regular life, visiting someone in the hospital would require checking calendars, rearranging meetings, and coordinating with assistants. The idea of simply dropping everything to be present for another person was both foreign and appealing. Of course, he heard himself say, I'd be honored to visit her. Sarah's face brightened with relief. Great. She specifically asked if you might come. I think she gets lonely, especially in the hospital where everything is so impersonal. The morning passed slowly as Marcus waited for Sarah's lunch break. He spent time at a nearby library, partly to stay warm and partly to use their internet access to send a brief message to his assistant assuring her that he was safe, but unavailable for the next week. The message was vague enough to maintain his cover, but specific enough to prevent a missing person investigation. At noon, Sarah emerged from the diner carrying another bag of food. Maggie insisted on sending soup, she explained. Hospital food is terrible, and Mrs. Patterson needs proper nutrition to heal properly. The hospital was a 15-minute walk from the diner, through parts of the city that Marcus had never seen despite living in Portland for several years. The buildings here were older and more industrial, interspersed with small businesses and residential areas that showed varying degrees of maintenance and investment. The bus would be faster, Sarah explained as they walked, but Mrs. Patterson is in the old part of the hospital where parking is impossible. Walking actually gets us there quicker than driving and circling around looking for a space. Marcus realized that Sarah had developed intricate knowledge of navigating the city without a car, understanding bus routes, walking shortcuts, and the practical realities of urban transportation that his wealth had allowed him to ignore. When was the last time he had walked 15 minutes anywhere, let alone as a primary mode of transportation? The hospital was busier than Marcus expected for a weekday afternoon. The emergency room had a steady stream of people entering and leaving, and the elevators were crowded with visitors, patients, and staff. Sarah navigated the maze of corridors with the confidence of someone who had been here many times before. Room 314, she said as they emerged from the elevator on the third floor. I called this morning, and she's doing well. Mostly frustrated about being stuck in bed again. They found Mrs. Patterson propped up in a hospital bed that made her look even more tiny and fragile than she had in her apartment. But her eyes were as alert as ever, and her face lit up when she saw them enter. My dear visitors, she exclaimed, extending her arms for hugs. Sarah, you shouldn't be spending your lunch break here. And Marcus, what a wonderful surprise. We brought you something better than hospital food, Sarah said, unpacking the container of soup and some fresh bread. Maggie's chicken and rice soup, still warm. Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. That woman is an angel. I've been living on Jell-O and mystery meat since yesterday. This smells like heaven. As Mrs. Patterson ate, she told them about her fall and the subsequent medical drama. She had been reaching for a book on a high shelf when she lost her balance, landing hard on her injured leg. A neighbor had heard the commotion and called an ambulance. The doctors want to keep me here for another day or two, she said with obvious frustration. They're worried about my blood pressure and want to make sure the leg isn't worse. But, honestly, I'd heal faster at home where I can get proper food and sleep. Marcus listened to her complaints about hospital inefficiencies and wondered how different her experience would be if she had the platinum-level insurance that covered his own medical care. Would she have a private room instead of sharing with 3 other patients? Would she have access to specialists and personalized attention instead of overworked nurses managing dozens of cases? The worst part, Mrs. Patterson continued, is knowing that every day I'm here costs more than I spend on groceries in a month. Even with Medicare, there will be bills I can't afford. Sarah reached over and squeezed her hand. Don't worry about that now. Focus on getting better. We'll figure out the rest later. But Marcus could see the worry in Mrs. Patterson's eyes. Here was a woman who had worked for 35 years, paid her taxes, and saved what she could, now facing financial stress because of a medical emergency. The injustice of it struck him with unexpected force. Tell me about your time at the post office, Marcus said, hoping to distract her from her worries. Sarah mentioned you worked there for decades. Mrs. Patterson's expression brightened as she began sharing stories from her career. She talked about the evolution of mail delivery, the relationships she had built with customers on her route, and the sense of pride she had felt in connecting people across distances. People don't realize how important mail carriers are to a community, she said with passion. We were often the only regular contact some people had with the outside world. I knew which elderly customers might need help, which families were going through hard times, which kids were excited about birthday cards from grandparents. Marcus found himself fascinated by her stories of human connection and community service. In his world, communication happened instantly through digital channels, but there was something profound about the physical delivery of letters and packages that created bonds between people. Do you miss it? He asked. Every day, Mrs. Patterson admitted. Retirement is fine, but I miss feeling useful. I miss being part of people's daily lives in a meaningful way. Sarah looked at her watch and sighed. I should get back to the diner soon. The dinner prep won't do itself. Of course, dear. You've already done too much for an old lady. Mrs. Patterson turned to Marcus. Will you stay a few more minutes? I don't get much conversation here, and you're such a good listener. Marcus nodded, though he felt like a fraud. Mrs. Patterson was calling him a good listener when he was essentially lying to her about who he was and why he was there. Yet her genuine appreciation for his presence was touching. After Sarah left, Mrs. Patterson studied Marcus more intently. You know, you remind me of my grandson. He's about your age, very thoughtful and observant. But there's something different about you that I can't quite put my finger on. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. Different how? You ask interesting questions. Most people your age who are struggling to find work are more focused on their immediate problems. You seem curious about bigger things, about how the world works, and why people make the choices they do. Her perception was unerringly accurate. Marcus realized that despite his efforts to blend in, his education and background were probably more obvious than he thought. People who had truly experienced poverty and hardship might have different priorities and perspectives than he was displaying. I've always been curious about people, Marcus said carefully. Maybe too curious sometimes. Curiosity is a gift, Mrs. Patterson replied. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The world needs more people who ask questions and really listen to the answers. They talked for another hour about books, politics, and life experiences. Mrs. Patterson was remarkably well-read and informed, with strong opinions about social policy and economic inequality that challenged some of Marcus's assumptions about the intelligence and awareness of people living on fixed incomes. The problem with being poor in America, she said at one point, is that people assume you must be stupid or lazy. They can't imagine that someone might be broke despite working hard and making good decisions. Bad luck, medical bills, economic downturns, they happen to all kinds of people, but somehow poverty is always seen as a personal failing. Her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. How many times had he made those exact assumptions? How many times had he attributed his own success to superior intelligence or work ethic rather than acknowledging the role of privilege, luck, and systemic advantages? When visiting hours ended, Marcus said goodbye to Mrs. Patterson with mixed emotions. Her warmth and wisdom had touched him deeply, but her financial worries haunted him. Here was a woman who had contributed to her community for decades, who had paid her taxes and saved responsibly, now facing potential poverty because of circumstances beyond her control. As he walked back toward the shelter, Marcus found himself calculating numbers in his head. Mrs. Patterson's hospital bills would probably amount to less than he spent on a single business lunch. Her monthly medication costs were probably less than he tipped his doorman at Christmas. The rent on her modest apartment was probably less than he spent on wine in a typical month. The mathematical reality of wealth inequality had always been abstract to Marcus, expressed in statistics and policy papers. Now it had a face and a name. Mrs. Patterson was not a number in a poverty study. She was a real person whose life could be dramatically improved with resources that would be insignificant to someone like him. That evening at the shelter, Marcus lay awake thinking about the day's experiences. The phone calls from his office seemed to belong to a different universe from Mrs. Patterson's hospital room. The problems that his executives considered urgent and important paled in comparison to an elderly woman's fear of choosing between medication and groceries. Yet Marcus also understood that his two worlds were more connected than they appeared. The economic policies that his company lobbied for, the wage structures he approved, the communities where he chose to locate facilities, all of these decisions affected people like Mrs. Patterson, Sarah, and their neighbors. His choices as a business leader had real consequences for real people, even when he never saw or thought about those consequences. The next morning brought another gray, rainy day that seemed to reflect Marcus's increasingly complex emotional state. He was nearing the end of his planned 2-week experiment, but he felt nowhere near ready to return to his previous life. The insights he was gaining seemed too important to abandon, yet the pressures from his business responsibilities were mounting. He decided to spend the morning volunteering at a local food bank that he had discovered during his walks through the neighborhood. The coordinator, an energetic woman named Janet, welcomed him enthusiastically and put him to work sorting donated goods and preparing bags for distribution. "We see about 200 families a week," Janet explained as they worked. "The demand has increased significantly in the past few years. More working families who just can't make ends meet." Marcus found the volunteer work both humbling and educational. Many of the food bank clients were employed, but earning wages that didn't cover basic living expenses. Others were elderly people on fixed incomes, disabled individuals unable to work full-time, or families dealing with temporary crises like job loss or medical emergencies. "People are usually embarrassed when they first come here," Janet continued. "They never expected to need help with something as basic as food. But hunger doesn't discriminate. It affects all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons." As the morning progressed, Marcus began to recognize some faces from the neighborhood. There was the teenage boy he had seen helping others at the bus stop, now picking up groceries for his family. The elderly man from the corner market was there too, selecting carefully from the available options. When lunchtime approached, Marcus found himself automatically heading back toward Maggie's kitchen. The routine had become comforting, and he was curious about how Mrs. Patterson was doing. But as he approached the diner, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Through the window, he could see Sarah sitting alone at a table, holding what appeared to be a letter or document. Even from the distance, Marcus could see that she was upset. Her shoulders were shaking slightly, and she kept wiping her eyes. Marcus hesitated, unsure whether he should intrude on what was obviously a private moment. But his concern for Sarah overcame his uncertainty, and he pushed open the door. Sarah looked up when she heard the bell, quickly trying to compose herself. "Oh, Marcus, I didn't expect to see you so early. Is everything okay?" Marcus asked, sitting down across from her. "You look upset." Sarah attempted a smile, but it was unconvincing. "Just some paperwork. Nothing important." Marcus could see that she was holding what appeared to be a medical bill or insurance statement. The amount visible at the top of the page was substantial enough to explain her distress. "Sometimes talking helps," Marcus said gently. "I'm a good listener, or so I've been told." For a moment, Sarah seemed to consider brushing off his concern. Then, something in his expression seemed to break down her resistance, and the words came tumbling out. "It's my mom's medical bills. Even though she passed away 6 months ago, the bills keep coming. Apparently, there were treatments that weren't covered by insurance, and Now they're saying I'm responsible for the debt. Marcus felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. How much are they asking for? Sarah showed him the bill, and Marcus had to hide his shock at how modest the amount was. It was substantial enough to devastate someone living paycheck to paycheck, but it was less than Marcus spent on a weekend trip. I've been trying to negotiate with them, Sarah continued, but they keep adding interest and fees. I don't know how I'm going to pay it. I've already picked up extra shifts here, but it's not enough. Marcus's mind began racing through possibilities. He wanted to help, but he couldn't reveal his true identity without raising questions that would be impossible to answer. Yet seeing Sarah's distress over an amount that was essentially pocket change to him felt like a cruel joke. Have you talked to a lawyer? Marcus asked. Sometimes these medical debt collectors don't have the legal right to collect what they're claiming. I can't afford a lawyer, Sarah replied with a bitter laugh. The consultation fee alone would probably cost more than I make in a week. Marcus realized that he was seeing yet another aspect of how poverty created vicious cycles. People who couldn't afford legal representation were vulnerable to exploitation by debt collectors, just as people without insurance were vulnerable to medical bankruptcy. The same systemic inequalities that had affected Mrs. Patterson were now threatening Sarah. What if you just ignored the bills? Marcus suggested, knowing it was probably bad advice, but curious about her reasoning. I can't do that. It would ruin my credit, and I need good credit to eventually get my own place. Besides, it was my mom's debt. I feel responsible for it, even if legally I might not be. Her sense of honor and responsibility was admirable, but Marcus could see how it was trapping her in an impossible situation. Sarah was sacrificing her own financial security out of loyalty to her mother's memory and a moral code that the debt collectors were happy to exploit. As they talked, Marcus began to understand more about Sarah's life and the constraints that shaped her choices. She had dropped out of nursing school not just because of her mother's illness, but because the family had no savings to cover both medical expenses and tuition. She had been working multiple part-time jobs since she was 16, contributing to household expenses and her mother's care. I keep telling myself that things will get better, Sarah said, folding the bill and putting it away. But sometimes it feels like I'm just treading water, never actually getting ahead. Marcus recognized the exhaustion in her voice. It was the weariness of someone who had been fighting an uphill battle for so long that the struggle had become her normal state of existence. Yet despite her own challenges, she continued to show kindness to others, to bring meals to Mrs. Patterson, to treat homeless strangers with dignity and respect. You're stronger than you know, Marcus said, meaning it completely. And you're making a difference in people's lives, even when you feel like you're just surviving. Sarah managed a more genuine smile. Thank you. I needed to hear that today. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just fooling myself about being happy with this life. Her comment reminded Marcus of Mrs. Patterson's earlier observation about Sarah putting everyone else's needs first. He was beginning to understand that Sarah's contentment with her neighborhood and her job might be partly a defense mechanism, a way of making peace with limited options rather than a true reflection of her deepest desires and ambitions. What would you do if money weren't a consideration? Marcus asked. If you could pursue any path you wanted? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the busy street. I used to dream about finishing nursing school, maybe becoming a nurse practitioner, working in community health. But those dreams feel pretty unrealistic now. Marcus could hear the longing in her voice, the carefully suppressed hope that she had learned not to indulge too much. Here was someone with the intelligence, compassion, and dedication to make a real difference in healthcare, trapped by circumstances that prevented her from pursuing her calling. Dreams don't have expiration dates, Marcus said. Maybe the path is different than you originally planned, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. Maybe, Sarah replied, but Marcus could tell she didn't really believe it. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself more determined than ever to find a way to help Sarah and Mrs. Patterson without revealing his true identity. But he was also beginning to realize that individual acts of charity, while important, were inadequate responses to the systemic problems he was witnessing. The issues affecting this community: poverty, wages, expensive healthcare, lack of affordable housing, limited educational opportunities required structural solutions, not just individual generosity. As someone with significant wealth and influence, Marcus had the power to advocate for policy changes and business practices that could improve conditions for thousands of people like Sarah and Mrs. Patterson. Yet he also understood that such efforts would be most effective if they were informed by the kind of direct experience he was gaining through his experiment. The insights he was gathering from living among people affected by these problems were invaluable in ways that no amount of reading or research could replicate. Marcus spent a sleepless night at the shelter, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. The weight of his dual identity was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Every conversation with Sarah and Mrs. Patterson felt like a betrayal, yet he was learning things that would have been impossible to discover any other way. By morning, he had made a decision that would change the course of his experiment. Instead of heading straight to breakfast, Marcus slipped out early and made his way to a 24-hour internet cafe several blocks away. Using a computer terminal, he logged into his encrypted business accounts and began a series of carefully orchestrated transactions. Within an hour, he had established an anonymous foundation, funded it with $5 million, and created protocols for distributing assistance that would appear completely unconnected to his real identity. The foundation, which he named Second Chances Community Fund, was designed to help individuals and families facing temporary financial crises. All transactions would be handled through a reputable law firm that specialized in anonymous charitable giving. Recipients would never know the source of their assistance, believing instead that they had qualified for help from a national foundation that supported working families in need. Next, Marcus used his contacts to arrange for a team of social workers and legal advocates to begin operating in the neighborhood under the foundation's auspices. Their job would be to identify people like Sarah and Mrs. Patterson who were struggling with debt, medical bills, or other financial challenges that threatened their stability. By the time he made it to Maggie's kitchen for breakfast, Marcus felt like he had a concrete plan for addressing at least some of the problems he had witnessed. The irony was not lost on him that he was using his wealth and influence to help people who had no idea who he really was. Sarah greeted him with her usual warmth, but Marcus could see that she was still stressed about the medical bills. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she had not slept well, and her smile seemed forced. "How's Mrs. Patterson doing?" Marcus asked as Sarah brought him coffee and toast. "She's being discharged today, thank goodness. But she's worried about the hospital bills on top of everything else. Sometimes I think the stress of medical debt is worse than the actual medical problems." Marcus nodded sympathetically while privately making mental notes. Mrs. Patterson would be among the first recipients of assistance from his new foundation. Within a few days, she would receive a call informing her that she had qualified for a program that covered medical expenses for seniors living on fixed incomes. "At least she'll be back in her own apartment where she's comfortable," Marcus offered. "Yes, but she shouldn't be living alone with her mobility issues. The problem is assisted living facilities cost more per month than most people make in a year. It's a broken system." Sarah's comment sparked another idea in Marcus's mind. What if he could create affordable housing specifically designed for elderly residents who needed some assistance but weren't ready for full nursing home care? It would be another project for his foundation to pursue, though on a much larger scale than individual financial assistance. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself studying the dynamics of Maggie's kitchen with new eyes. The diner was clearly an important community hub, providing not just food but a gathering place where people could connect and support each other. Yet he could see that the business itself was probably struggling financially. The equipment was old, the building needed updates, and the prices were kept artificially low to remain accessible to neighborhood residents. Maggie was essentially subsidizing community connection at the expense of her own profit margins. It was admirable, but probably unsustainable in the long term. When Maggie herself arrived around 10 o'clock, Marcus was struck by how much she resembled his mental image of her. She was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a flour-dusted apron over simple clothes. Her face showed the lines of someone who had worked hard for decades, but her eyes were bright and kind. "You must be Marcus," she said, approaching his table with a warm smile. "Sarah's been telling me about you. Welcome to our little corner of the world." "Thank you," Marcus replied, standing to shake her hand. "This place is special." You've created something really meaningful here. Maggie waved off the compliment with obvious embarrassment. I just serve food and try to treat people decently. Nothing fancy about it. But Marcus could see that it was much more than that. In his business experience, he had seen many attempts to create community spaces and foster customer loyalty. Most failed because they were designed from a corporate perspective rather than growing organically from genuine human connection. Maggie's Kitchen succeeded because it was authentic, rooted in real relationships and mutual care. How long have you owned this place? Marcus asked. 25 years this October. Bought it from the previous owner when he retired. I was working as a waitress here and couldn't bear to see it close down. The neighborhood needed it too much. Her story reinforced Marcus's growing understanding of how small businesses functioned as community anchors. Maggie had sacrificed financial gain to preserve something valuable for her neighbors. It was exactly the kind of long-term thinking and community investment that his business school professors had taught him to avoid. It must be challenging to keep a small restaurant profitable, Marcus ventured. Profitable might be a strong word, Maggie admitted with a rueful laugh. Some months we break even, some months we don't. But we keep the doors open, and that's what matters. Marcus realized that Maggie's Kitchen was probably operating at a loss much of the time, sustained by Maggie's personal commitment and possibly her own savings. It was another example of how people in this community prioritized social value over financial return, often at their own expense. After Maggie moved on to greet other customers, Marcus spent the rest of the morning observing the restaurant's operations more carefully. He noticed which menu items were popular, how efficiently the small staff worked together, and what kinds of improvements might increase both customer satisfaction and profitability. By noon, he had developed a comprehensive plan for supporting Maggie's Kitchen through his foundation. The assistance would be structured as a small business development grant, focused on equipment upgrades and building improvements that would reduce operating costs while maintaining the diner's essential character. When Sarah's lunch break arrived, she invited Marcus to join her in visiting Mrs. Patterson, who was being discharged from the hospital that afternoon. They walked together through the now familiar neighborhood streets, and Marcus found himself memorizing details he would soon have to leave behind. "I'll miss this," he said without thinking. "Miss what?" Sarah asked. Marcus realized he had spoken out loud, revealing more than he intended. "Just this neighborhood. These walks. I'll probably be moving on soon." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him with obvious surprise. "Moving on? Where are you going?" Marcus had been dreading this moment. His 2-week experiment was nearly over, and he would need to return to his real life soon. But how could he explain his departure without raising suspicions about his true identity? "I've been offered a job in another city," he said carefully. "Good opportunity that I can't really pass up." The disappointment in Sarah's expression was unmistakable. "That's wonderful for you, of course. It's just, well, you've become part of the community here. People will miss you." "I'll miss everyone too," Marcus replied, and meant it completely. "More than you know." They continued walking in comfortable silence, but Marcus could feel that something had shifted between them. His announced departure had introduced an element of impermanence that changed the tenor of their friendship. At the hospital, they found Mrs. Patterson dressed and ready to go, sitting in a wheelchair as required by hospital policy. Despite her obvious relief at being discharged, she looked frail and uncertain about managing on her own. "My chariot awaits," she said with forced cheerfulness as an aide prepared to wheel her to the hospital entrance. "We're taking you home," Sarah said firmly. "And I'm staying to help you get settled." "Sarah, dear, you can't keep missing work to take care of me. You have your own life to live." Marcus watched this exchange with growing frustration. Here were two people he had come to care about deeply, both sacrificing their own needs to help each other, both struggling with problems that his wealth could easily solve. The forced passivity of his situation was becoming unbearable. The ride to Mrs. Patterson's apartment in Sarah's small, aging car was cramped but filled with animated conversation. Mrs. Patterson was eager to hear about everything that had happened in the neighborhood during her absence, and Sarah filled her in on local gossip and community news. "Oh, and Marcus has some news too," Sarah said as they climbed the stairs to the apartment. "He's been offered a job in another city." Mrs. Patterson looked at Marcus with sharp, knowing eyes. "Is that so? Well, I suppose we should have expected that someone with your obvious intelligence and education wouldn't stay in this neighborhood permanently. Her comment caught Marcus off guard. Had his disguise been less effective than he thought? What do you mean? Oh, dear boy, you don't really think you've been fooling anyone, do you? Your speech patterns, your questions, the way you observe everything so carefully, it's obvious you're not from around here originally. I've been wondering what brought you to our little corner of the world. Marcus felt his heart racing. If Mrs. Patterson had seen through his disguise, had others as well? I'm not sure what you mean. Mrs. Patterson settled into her favorite chair with obvious relief at being home. I mean that you're clearly educated and probably accustomed to a very different lifestyle than what you've been living lately. The question is whether you're running from something or looking for something. Sarah looked between them with confusion. Mrs. Patterson, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that our Marcus here is not quite who he appears to be. Am I right, dear? The moment of truth had arrived sooner than Marcus had expected. He could continue the deception, or he could trust these two remarkable women with the truth. The decision seemed to make itself. You're very perceptive, Marcus said quietly. I have been looking for something. Understanding, I suppose. And I think I've found it. Understanding of what? Sarah asked. Marcus took a deep breath. Of how people like you live, and what I might learn from that. Over the next hour, Marcus told them an edited version of his story. He explained that he was a wealthy businessman who had become disconnected from the realities faced by most Americans. He described his decision to live on the streets for 2 weeks to gain first-hand experience of poverty and homelessness. He did not reveal the full extent of his wealth or his corporate identity, but he was honest about his motivations and what he had learned from his experiment. He told them about his growing awareness of systemic inequalities and his desire to use his resources more effectively to help people facing the challenges he had witnessed. Sarah listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully, as if his revelation confirmed suspicions she had harbored all along. So when you asked for leftovers that first day, Sarah said slowly, you could have afforded to pay for a full meal? Yes, Marcus admitted. But I was trying to experience what it was like to have limited resources. I never expected to learn so much about kindness and community. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, her back to Marcus. He could see the tension in her shoulders and feared that his deception had destroyed the trust and friendship they had built. Are you angry? Marcus asked quietly. Sarah turned around, and he was surprised to see tears in her eyes. I don't know what I am. Confused, mostly. Here I've been feeling sorry for you, sharing my problems, accepting your sympathy. And all along, you were just studying us. It wasn't like that, Marcus said urgently. Yes, I started this as an experiment, but it became something much more important. You and Mrs. Patterson have taught me things about life that I never could have learned any other way. Your kindness wasn't wasted on me, it changed me. Mrs. Patterson spoke up from her chair. Sarah, dear, sit down and let the man explain himself properly. The question I have, Mrs. Patterson continued, addressing Marcus directly, is what you plan to do with what you've learned. Are you going back to your wealthy life with some interesting stories to tell at dinner parties? Or are you going to put your newfound understanding to good use? Marcus appreciated her directness. I want to help. I've already started a foundation to assist people facing the kinds of challenges I've witnessed. But I realize now that individual charity isn't enough. The problems I've seen require systemic changes in how businesses operate and how society supports its most vulnerable members. And you think you can make those changes happen? Sarah asked skeptically. I can try. I have resources and influence that could be used more effectively than they have been. But I'll need advisors who understand these issues from personal experience. I'll need people who can keep me honest and help me avoid the kind of disconnection that led to this experiment in the first place. Marcus paused, then took another deep breath. I'd like to ask both of you to consider working with me on these efforts, not as charity cases, but as partners and advisors. Your insights and experiences are invaluable. Sarah and Mrs. Patterson exchanged glances. What exactly are you proposing? Mrs. Patterson asked. Marcus outlined his vision for a new kind of foundation, one that would be guided by people who had lived the problems it was trying to solve. He described potential programs for affordable housing, healthcare assistance, education support, and small business development. He explained his desire to create systemic change rather than just providing temporary relief. It sounds impressive, Sarah said cautiously. But how do we know you won't just lose interest when the next new cause catches your attention? Rich people have a reputation for jumping from one charitable fad to another. You don't know, Marcus admitted. You'll have to judge me by my actions over time. But I can promise you this. This experience has fundamentally changed how I see the world and my responsibility in it. There's no going back to my previous level of ignorance and detachment. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward in her chair. What's your real name, son? Marcus hesitated, then decided that complete honesty was the only way forward. Marcus, as evening approached, and Marcus prepared to leave the diner, he realized that his experiment had evolved beyond its original scope. What had begun as a personal journey to understand homelessness had become a comprehensive education in economic inequality and social justice. He was seeing how individual lives were shaped by policy decisions made in distant boardrooms and government offices. Most importantly, he was beginning to understand his own responsibility as someone with the resources and influence to make a difference. The question was no longer just how to help individuals like Sarah and Mrs. Patterson, but how to use his position to address the root causes of the problems they faced. The remaining days of his experiment would need to focus on translating his newfound insights into concrete plans for action. Marcus was beginning to envision a different way of living and working, one that honored the lessons he was learning on the streets while leveraging his privilege and resources for maximum positive impact. But first, he needed to figure out how to help the two remarkable women who had opened his eyes to a world he never knew existed, despite having lived in the same city for years. Their kindness had transformed him. Now he needed to find a way to transform their circumstances in return. Marcus felt a pang of sadness at the thought of Mrs. Patterson's isolation, despite being surrounded by a caring community. Loneliness seemed to be an epidemic that affected rich and poor alike, though it manifested differently in different circumstances. Maybe I'll stop by to see her again before I leave town, Marcus said. She'd love that, Sarah replied warmly. You're welcome here anytime, you know. Maggie's Kitchen has always been a place where everyone belongs. As Marcus stepped back onto the evening street, he carried with him a profound sense of having been welcomed into something precious and rare. In 2 days, he had experienced more genuine human kindness than he had in years of high society events and business networking. The contrast between his usual world and this community was stark, but it was also illuminating. He was beginning to understand that true wealth might not be measured in dollars and assets, but in the richness of relationships and the depth of human connection that people like Sarah and Mrs. Patterson enjoyed every day. That night, as Marcus lay on his narrow cot in the crowded shelter, he thought about Sarah's simple act of kindness and how it had affected him. In the corporate world, he was surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Investors seeking returns, employees seeking promotions, politicians seeking donations. But Sarah had asked for nothing and expected nothing in return. Her generosity had been pure and unconditional. Marcus realized that his experiment was teaching him lessons that would extend far beyond his understanding of homelessness. It was revealing the profound difference between charity that came from guilt or obligation and compassion that came from genuine human connection. Sarah had not helped him because she felt sorry for him or because it would look good on her resume. She had helped him because she saw him as a fellow human being deserving of dignity and care. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus began to formulate ideas for how he could apply these insights to his business and philanthropic activities. But, more importantly, he was beginning to understand that true wealth lay not in the accumulation of money and power, but in the ability to connect with and care for other people. The encounter at Maggie's Kitchen had lasted less than an hour, but it had planted seeds that would continue to grow throughout the remainder of his time on the streets. Marcus was beginning to see that his experiment would change not just his understanding of poverty, but his entire approach to living as a human being in relationship with others.